this evening is part of a tradition for many, many years we've done at Brown to talk about the elections. I'm going to give a quick overview, which will be 10 to 12 minutes about the history of Brazil in the last 35 years. There's space down here, and encourage people to come on down. And then we have three panelists, which I'd like to introduce, and we're really happy to have all three of them with us tonight. We have Leila Lehnen, who is an associate professor of Portuguese and Brazilian studies and the current chair of Portuguese and Brazilian studies. André Pagliarini, who is a visiting assistant professor of history at Brown University, who received his doctorate last year and is teaching this year. And Benito Schmidt, who is a visiting scholar here, the former president of the Brazilian Historical Association and a professor of history at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. So the title of our event tonight is Making Sense of Brazilians' 2018 Elections. And I know a lot of you in the room know this, but some of you might not. And so I wanted to give a quick overview of what's happening. And as I've warned people in the last month, fasten your seatbelts because it's going to be a bumpy ride. So first of all, I would like to make this event in homage of Marielle Franco, the city councilwoman from Rio de Janeiro who was assassinated over 6 months ago. We still do not know who committed the crime of murdering her. And she is very much present with us in her heart as a person who fought for the rights of the poor, the disenfranchised, the LGBT community, people of color in Brazil. Marielle, presente. So the Brazilian military dictatorship was in power from 1964 to 85, and the process of democratization led to the Constituent Assembly of 1988, which brought many very progressive measures to Brazil, including the right for illiterate people who did not have knowledge of writing and reading to be able to vote. In the first election that happened the next year, the two finalist candidates were Fernando Collor de Mello and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, quite well known for having been a union leader in the process for the rights for labor in Brazil at the end of the dictatorship, the leader of the Workers' Party, and an important leader in Brazilian history in the last 30 years. Collor de Mello won that election and was ousted from power by a massive mobilization calling for his impeachment for his being personally involved in corruption, leading his vice presidential candidate to become the president in the interim. Brazil facing a serious economic crisis of multi-digit inflation, leading to a new change of the currency and a new economic policy under Minister of Finance Fernando Cardoso, who later became a visiting professor at Brown University, who then successfully was elected president in the second election in which Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva challenged the largest political party of the center-right, the PSDB. And as you see here, he won in the first round of the elections. It was a clear victory for Cardoso and his economic policies. He then passed a law that allowed him to be reelected as a representative of the Party of Social Democracy in Brazil, and in a second contest with Lula in 1998, also won in the first round, defeating Lula 53% to 31%. And so basically, over the course of the democratic period, we started to see a polarization between two camps, a center-right camp represented by the PSDB and a center-left camp represented by the PT. Although many of you know, there are currently 28 legal parties, 35 parties, but 28 which have legal representation in Congress. This requires any president being elected to build a coalition in Congress to consolidate power and to rule. The fourth time that Lula decided to run, he changed his strategy. He presented himself as Lula, as they used to joke about him, Lula Passimor, Lula Light, ran a very dynamic campaign, assured investors and people in the financial community that he was not going to carry out radical social reforms, and in fact would make concessions and work with the entrepreneurial community for the betterment of Brazil, and was elected in the second round against José Serra, former student activist and governor of the state of São Paulo, and carried out a series of reforms, the most famous being Bolsa Família, to expand social inclusion in Brazil. In The fact that the Workers' Party did not have a majority in the Congress, did not have the ability to kind of pass legislation, led members of the Workers' Party to carry out a vote-buying scheme, basically giving money each month to people in other political parties to guarantee their vote, known as the Mensalão scandal, and eventually the people involved in that were convicted and sentenced and served time in prison for this corruption scandal. This, however, did not affect Lula's popularity, and he won in 2006 in the second election to Geraldo Alckmin, who had been the governor of the state of São Paulo. And if you know, today he's one of the candidates again running in this election. Lula left after 8 years in power with 80% popularity, probably the most popular president in the history of Brazil, and had appointed, and at the time he was in office, the economy grew, largely because of two factors. The fact that there was extreme, Brazil benefited by the expansion of commodity exports, especially to China, whose economy was growing significantly, and because his policy of economic redistribution through various programs generated tremendous activity in the economy, as many more people had access to the market economy, and the credit economy were able to buy things. So the economy really took off in this period. He then appointed his chief of staff, Dilma Rousseff, a former student activist and revolutionary, a minister of mines and energy, and his chief of staff to carry out the banner of the Workers' Party. And she won in 2010 in the second round, once again against José Serra, 56% to 44%. And this was the general kind of voter mapping of the time, where the North and the Northeast, Minas Gerais and Rio de Janeiro, tended to support Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party, whereas the Center-South and the South tended to support the center-right, although you can see that it's not as simple as that, because there are pockets in both areas of the country of people of the other political bloc. She was given, as part of her political coalition, to have a majority in Congress, the candidacy of Michel Temer, who was of the PMDB, the historical party of the opposition during the dictatorship, who was the candidate of the PMDB, serving in office as vice president in her first term in office, and then in the second term of office. And then in 2013, an unusual situation occurred, beginning in Porto Alegre, where students were mobilizing against high cost of bus fares, the increase in bus fares, that spread in São Paulo to mobilizations around many issues. This is a very controversial question still as to what are the causes and the factors involved in these mobilizations, the Jew mobilizations. In part, they were to demand that the Workers' Party expand the promises of improving economics, education, health, transportation. And then in the midst of these mobilizations, another group of people joined that were criticizing the government, not to say carry out successfully your promises, but saying we don't like what the government is doing at all. And a movement against Dilma and her government came to pass. And this was in the context of Brazil's decision to build stadiums for the FIFA World Cup championships in 2014, and people questioning the priorities. Still in 2014, Dilma's coalition of the center-left won, although this was the closest race in the history of post-dictatorship Brazil. The spread was 3 points, whereas the spread by Lula and Collor was 6 points. And we have to keep in mind that Obama's spread was 3 points also in the election when he won. Again, the same kind of pattern of divisions, although if we were to look at the other detailed map, we would see that it's much more complex than the simple northeast versus southwest. Then, right after the elections, kind of previewed before the elections, it was revealed that leading members of Petrobras, the state oil company, were involved in siphoning money off to their own pocket or using this money for corrupt purposes. An investigation began as the economy started to shrink for many reasons, and the economy, as the economist said, was now going in a tailspin, coupled with police investigations in the car wash or Lava Jato, finding money laundering and corruption in many political parties, but investigating primarily the center-right, the center-left political parties, led by Sergio Moro, investigating judge. Many of the people accused then were involved in plea bargaining, where they promised to reveal information in order to have lighter sentences, and this has led to the conviction of some people, and other people's plea bargaining thrown out because it was argued and proven that they actually were making up stories in order to have lighter sentences. The investigations are still going on, leading to massive mobilizations by the center-right, calling for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and her ouster from power, leading to, in fact, in the Congress, which was divided, sectors of the center-right abandoning Dilma's coalition, led by Eduardo Cunha of the PMDB, under charges for corruption himself, decided to split with Dilma Rousseff and form part of the opposition. She was convicted the reason they call Pedaladas is because she was she had gotten cancer, and she was told by her doctor she needed to do a lot of exercises, and so she was pedaling, and so the moving of funds within the government budgets justified, according to those who supported the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, voted first in the House and then confirmed by the Senate, and she was ousted, and so Michel Temer became the president, being the least popular president with a 3% population support, or 4%, I think, in the polls right now in the history of Brazil. And this was symbolic at the time. His first council of cabinet ministers were all white men who led his government in the first moment. There are a series of things that he's done. I'm not going to go into details, including calling for the reform of the Social Security system, of the labor laws, which actually was implemented, changing labor rights in terms of contracting and expanding independent contractors, and then charges against Lula, specifically for allegedly receiving an apartment in Guarujá in exchange for alleged benefits to a contractor, was convicted to 9 years, and then that was increased to 12 years. This is the apartment that he allegedly received, although he doesn't seem to have ever taken it, and that was the luxurious kitchen that you see on the right there that the apartment allegedly had. So Lula was imprisoned in April of this year, 12-year sentence in Curitiba, and carried out a campaign to try to be the candidate of the Workers' Party, which was denied because of the law of the clean slate that says a person who is lost in a second rank, a second-tier appeal, is not eligible to be a candidate. And so we now have the elections, which is the point of this whole forum. Tomorrow, it's Sunday, the first round of the elections, and on the 27th, Sunday, the second round. And the crumpled flag is because I would say that Brazil is facing the most important election in the history of the country, in a country that is absolutely, totally polarized. There are 13 candidates running, of which, and with Lula, although when he was arrested, he was at 30% popularity. A month later, there was 39% of the people said they wanted to vote for his candidacy, and he was in the lead, but he wasn't eligible to run. And so at this point, the 5 important candidates, I'm going to run through them quickly and then let our panelists speak, are Jair Bolsonaro, sorry, I spelled that wrong. Bolsonaro. It was not intentional, but it must have been subconsciously intentional. I didn't really do that on purpose. It's a new name we've given him. Okay. And I think other people are going to talk about who he is and what he represents. So I'm just putting range of numbers because the numbers in the last 2 days are very confusing. There's some people questioning the methodology of the polling. But he is ranging between 28 and 32% in the polls for the first round. After him is Fernando Haddad, which is ranging from 21 to 24%. Within that range, which he's polled in the last 3 or 4 days, there's the margin of error of 2 to 3%. Ciro Gomes, who is part of kind of the center left in the political spectrum, with 9 to 11%. It really has changed in the last couple of days. Geraldo Alckmin, who very curiously for everyone is only at 9%, has not really taken off as a candidate. If you see, in 2006 he got 39%, and he's only at 9%. And then Marina Silva, who also was an important candidate, is really polling at 4 or 5% now. In 2010, she surprised everyone by getting 19%. In 2014, I erroneously predicted, so I'm not going to do any predictions tonight, that she would be in the second round of the elections in 2014, and she in turn happened not to be, but then turned and then endorsed the center-right candidate, Aécio Neves. And then Guilerme Boulos, who is at 1% of PSOL, which is the party to the left of the Workers' Party, and is polling at 1%. So these are very approximate. The latest second poll rounds, which are I don't know how reliable they are, but they do predict that in a race of Bolsonaro and Haddad, they're basically tied, but there's a kind of a slight favorability to Bolsonaro, but there just came out a new poll today who's saying just the opposite, so I think it's hard to know. Ciro Gomes also is almost tied with a little edge over Bolsonaro, and Alckmin, again, were he to be a candidate, would be closely favorable to Bolsonaro. It's theoretically possible in the next 3 or 4 days that Alckmin will surge ahead or Gomes will surge ahead and be in number 2 spot, but I think the one thing I can safely predict, short of an earthquake or an assassination or a plane crashing, and we all know that reference, that it's likely that the people in the runoff are going to be Bolsonaro against Haddad. And so this is my message. Oh my God, what is happening in Brazil? Okay, thank you very much.
Should I just plug in mine, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are a couple of seats here. People want to come down. A couple of seats. 1 or 2 over here. There's a seat here. There's a seat back there. It's going to be a long night. Enjoy. Get comfortable. Raise your hand if there's a seat near you. There's one here. There's one there. I think that's.
Should I get started? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ramon, for organizing this, and Jim for inviting me. I want to start with a caveat. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm just going to give you a breakdown of some of the numbers that Jim already told you, and then give you some more numbers, and try to understand a little bit the Bolsonaro phenomenon, because it has been intriguing me in not a very good way. I'm going to start off, so I'm Brazilian. I'm from southern Brazil, which at this moment is not a point of pride for me, and you'll understand why soon. But I'm going to start with a short anecdote. I was at the Brazilian Studies Conference in Rio this summer, and we had gone to lunch, me and a group. And as we were leaving the place where we had lunch, there was a street performer, trans street performer, and I gave her some money. And as I was, moving away, this elderly gentleman basically attacked me verbally, asking me how I dared to do this and give this money to this person who, he called a vagabunda and, a useless person, etc. And I was struck by the aggression in the tone and by the gesture itself, because I don't remember this happening in Brazil to this extent, this overtly. People might have thought that, but they would not have come up to me and me agredir dessa forma, right? And so I started thinking about it, and it kind of has some echoes with what happened, I think, in this country. Is happening in this country is a discourse being legitimized by certain political candidates, specifically in this case, Bolsonaro. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the presentation. First, I want to kind of give you a rundown of some of the numbers that Jim brought already, and then some other numbers as well, for you to get an idea of how kind of the Brazilian electorate is configured at the moment, as of today or yesterday, okay? So very quickly, and these numbers are slightly different, but not that much different from Jim. So you have the approval ratings, 31 to 32% for Bolsonaro. Haddad is in the 21 to 22 ratio. The gender divide, you can see that there are men poll much more in favor of Bolsonaro. Interestingly enough, women that about last week were polling about 21% of approval rating for Bolsonaro, those numbers went up. Now they're at around 28%, so there was an increase of about 6 to 7% of women who approve of Bolsonaro. The second round, the polls I looked at, they were basically tied, in Bolsonaro and Haddad. Rejection rates are pretty high for both candidates. Haddad's rejection rate has been going up considerably in the last few days. Other factors that we need to consider in this election is the fact that 23% of Brazilians do not know who Haddad is, okay? So that could change, supposedly. I see the chuckles, but, you know, and we can talk about that. And there's also a high percentage of voters who said that they would annul their vote, okay? To give you a point of comparison, in 2014, so during the last presidential elections, 6% of the people declared that they would annul their vote. So it's more than double in this election. And the total invalid and absentee votes in 2014 was 28%. So you can see kind of, you know, and that figure, you know, it can oscillate, obviously. So this is a breakdown, more or less, of the second round. You see, again, it's very similar to the numbers that Jim brought. Here you have Ciro actually polling a little bit better than Bolsonaro, and then those two are tied. Okay. Okay, so you can see that how the polls have changed from September 24th to the 29th. So the biggest change is, I would say, Bolsonaro having gotten this bump. And I'm not sure what happened in those few days of why he did that. And the rejection rates of Haddad that went up considerably also in these few days. Okay, and then more data. So you have, again, voter intention, right? And then the breakdown by gender. Again, you saw that. And then this is interesting, these numbers. So you can see, I was very surprised when I saw these numbers about how many people who have a university education are planning to vote for Bolsonaro, considering that in his discourse he's not necessarily very supportive of education, et cetera. So 43%. Okay. These numbers are, I don't know if I would say surprising. So up to 2 minimum salaries, 2 to 5 minimum wage, 5 to 10, so this is middle class, middle income, and then that's the highest income bracket, more than 10 minimum salaries. As you can see, he has a very solid support in the middle income. And the discourse has been very much, well, a lot of his votes are coming from the Brazilian peripheries, you know, because of the question of violence, et cetera. I think these polls show us it's not just the Brazilian peripheries, and you cannot just chalk it up to violence. And, you know, the other factor that is attributed to why he's so popular among the Brazilian peripheries is the fact that there's a lot of evangelicals in the Brazilian peripheries, and the evangelicals are 100% supportive of him. They are very strong political, not party, but association, basically. So, and then you have the breakdown by the different regions, and this is why I'm not very proud to be from the South right now. So you have Southeast, which is Minas Gerais, Espírito Santo, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, supports Bolsonaro, Centro-Oeste, Mato Grosso, I think Goiás, Brasília, Nordeste. Then the South is by far the region that supports him the most. And then in the North, he also has support. So the region that is the least supportive of him is the Northeast, where the PT has been, as Jim shown you, also has been able to have a lot of support. And then we have the breakdown by religious affiliations. So atheist, that number, as you can see, Haddad is the most popular among those. Then you have the Afro-descendant religions, Umbanda Candomblé, and other Afro-descendant religions. Catholics, it's more or less tied. Evangelicals, you can see, Bolsonaro has the absolute lead. So I don't know if, do you know what Spiritism is? Yes, no, more or less. Okay, so Bolsonaro also leads with this among the Spiritists, which was surprising to me, I think. Classe média. And then no religious affiliation. That was also fairly surprising, where he's at, I think, 25%. So, okay. Next slide. No surprises there. White voters overwhelmingly support Bolsonaro, as do Asian Brazilians, so Chinese Brazilians, Japanese Brazilians, etc. Then Afro-Brazilians and indigenous Brazilians are not as supportive of him. Once again, there's no surprises there. Okay. So what are some of the causes for Bolsonaro's popularity? Basically, I was trying to, I read, and I was also I talked to some people in Brazil, and the causes that always come up in these conversations, and I guess, you can contradict me, is insecurity, corruption, a very, very strong anti-PT, anti-PT Workers' Party sentiment, rise of conservative social mores, and fear. So beyond the fear of criminality, etc., there's a fear that Brazil will become Venezuela. Okay, and yeah, well, I had the same reaction when I was told that, but we will all speak Spanish. Yeah. But it's actually supposedly a true fear. People think that Brazil, if the PT wins, will become what Venezuela is now. And I have a little video that attests to that was used in the campaign. So there's another cause that I forgot to put on this PowerPoint, and that's the idea that Bolsonaro will improve the economy. Brazil's economy, as you know, has been quite problematic in the last, 4 or 5 years, et cetera. Growth rates have been very anemic, and they think that, considering that he has a more liberal-oriented, market-oriented economic policy, that he will fix Brazil's economic woes. Okay. And then, there are all kinds of rumors being circulated, okay? So this is not a fake news. It's in the site of the Chamber of Deputies. The PT has a project to confiscate all goods, private goods. Read this if you do not want to transform this Brazil into Venezuela. So they're talking about confiscating the savings accounts of private property, and this will happen if the left wins the election. So there's this old fear of communism, which is a discourse, a rhetoric that was used also in 1964 with the coup d'etat then, that is resurging. And as you might know, Bolsonaro has been very much supportive of the 1964 coup. He doesn't call it a coup. He has denied that, people were tortured and killed, et cetera. And you see this rhetoric kind of infiltrating other areas of the Brazilian public imagination. And as I said, this fear that Brazil will become Venezuela, will become a communist country, is showcased in this video. I'm sorry, it doesn't have the subtitles, but
Chávez e Maduro tinham as mesmas concepções em relação aos desafios que a Venezuela tinha pela frente, em defesa dos mais pobres. Maduro, presidente, é a Venezuela que Chávez sonhou.
Na Venezuela, a situação econômica piorou tanto que as pessoas estão fazendo fila para comprar carne estragada em promoção.
O presidente da Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, foi visto filmado em uma churrascaria de luxo na Turquia, enquanto a população do país que ele comanda passa fome.
O senhor acha que a Venezuela é uma democracia?
A Venezuela é uma democracia tão democrática quanto a brasileira e a americana.
Não estamos mais falando sobre uma eleição. Ou você acredita em um futuro, ou acredita na esquerda. Homens como Ciro, Lula, Haddad dizem abertamente que a Venezuela é uma...
sorry.
Homens que prometem libertar condenados por corrupção e frear a Lava Jato.
Você imagina se um caba desse outro lado, o Lula tem alguma chance de sair da cadeia? Nenhuma, né? Só tem chance de sair da cadeia se a gente assumir o poder e organizar a carga, botar juiz para voltar para a caixinha dele, botar...
Pois o que eles querem é calar a justiça, calar a imprensa. E acham que um país onde se mata o seu povo pelas ruas e se come carne podre é um bom lugar para viver. Não, nossos filhos não merecem carne podre. Nossa gente não merece covardia.
Esse nazista, filho da puta, que nós vamos derrotar!
Okay, sorry about the language. Anyway, so as you can see, this is a campaign video, and it squarely puts Ciro, Gomes, and Haddad in this. It equates them with Maduro and Chavez, and the whole, and creates this fear that Brazil will become Venezuela, which becomes particularly poignant, considering that there are many Venezuelans that have come to Brazil because of the crisis in Venezuela. So it, and there was unrest because of that. So basically, to come back a little bit to the beginning, we have this discourse of fear-mongering by candidates such as Bolsonaro that is tapping into certain fears that were there already and into certain prejudices that I think are latent in Brazilian society that then become expressed in these very vitriolic ways, in such advertisements, but also in personal interactions to a degree. I think that Brazil has become much more polarized. I do not remember any political campaign that was this, divided, and I think it has divided Brazilian society quite a bit. And the question as we move forward, I don't know who's going to win, neither in the first nor the second round, is how are we going as Brazilians and also as people who engage with Brazil, how are we going to deal with this polarization, with the consequences, not only of possibly Bolsonaro winning, right, but also if Haddad or somebody else wins, because what the legacy of this polarization and of the crisis will be there and will haunt whatever person is in government, right? So I think that's kind of what we need to be thinking about, not so much only about who is going to win, although that's a scary prospect in itself also. So that's what I have to say.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank Ramon for organizing this and Jim for inviting me. I also want to thank Leila for putting all these numbers on the table, which I intend to sort of build on. My contribution tonight, I think, will be mostly sort of tonal
and emotional. Many of us are here for sort of different reasons, right? Some of us know that there's an election coming up soon, and we've maybe been following it a little bit in the newspaper. Some of us have been following it closely and want a space to talk about it and to debate. I'm here sort of for a little bit of hope in a group therapy session. Less than a week, so I was born in the United States, but my family's Brazilian. My family lives there. So I'm watching very closely. I'm very much invested in what's happening. And I'm not at all confident that something good is going to happen. I'm quite the contrary. I'm nervous that something very bad is going to happen. And as I go on through the talk, my point, what I hope to achieve tonight is to outline some of the reasons for my pessimism in order, hopefully, to get vigorous pushback, right? I hope to be convinced by my colleagues or everyone in the audience that I'm way off and that my predictions are going to be totally wrong. So, in my talk tonight, I'm going to question whether the far-right candidacy of Jair Bolsonaro can be stopped. A very careful reader might be able to discern from my cryptic title whether I think it can or cannot be stopped. And there are two main things that I hope to convey in this talk. The first is that Haddad and Bolsonaro are not opposite extremes. They're not symmetrical opposites on the ideological spectrum. Bolsonaro is an extremist who has said, among a million other things, that the discourse of human rights has done a disservice to Brazil, not to mention a whole host of horrible things he said. Whereas Haddad is a university professor who, to the extent that he is known, is probably best known for painting bike lanes across São Paulo during his one term as mayor. So the false equivalency has been a real problem, I think, driving some of this polarization that Leila was talking about. The second point I hope to make is that while being Lula's man will almost certainly be enough to get Haddad to the second round, it will not be enough for him to win. He needs to be able to win over some more moderate conservative voters who can be convinced that Bolsonaro is a step too far in the wrong direction. This is an enormous challenge, given the polarization that, again, that Jim and Leila talked about in this climate, to convince voters that however mad they are at the PT, that Bolsonaro is not the answer. And I'm just not sure Haddad can thread that needle, given the political landscape in Brazil today. So as Jim was saying, in April, Lula was essentially backed into a corner, but he was able to negotiate the terms of his surrender in a way that dramatically illustrated his popular support and his standing in recent Brazilian history. It was almost certain to anyone who was being sort of honest with themselves that his candidacy would be barred. He would not be allowed to run. And it was also clear that his fate would cast a shadow over the campaign, and it has. Whether or not he would be allowed to run was a question up until September. There was whispered talk of who might replace Lula at the top of the ticket. Names like Jacques Wagner, the former governor of Bahia, was in the mix, and several others. But one name that was also consistently mentioned was Fernando Haddad, who looking back, was very savvy at insinuating himself into the debate over the succession. After Haddad lost his re-election campaign in 2016 for the mayor of São Paulo, he met with Lula, and Lula said, "So what do you want to do now? What do you want your next step to be?" And he said, "Well, one thing I think I would enjoy is to write your campaign platform for this year. It seems pretty apolitical, right? I just want to be in charge of proposing the ideas." Well, by the time Lula was arrested and barred from candidacy, Haddad had been with him more than anybody else drafting the ideas. And so he was able now to go out and start campaigning on these ideas. There's some people who speculate that the reason Haddad was picked also is because he's not exactly that influential within the party, that he relies on his support from Lula. And so far, it seems he's been relatively successful in the campaign. He polls, as we've been saying, second place, considering the fact that he's not that widely known. It's a pretty impressive feat. And he's had a very strong vice presidential candidate in Manuela Dávila, who was a former congresswoman from the Communist Party of Brazil. Part of what concerns me, however, is that Manuela reinforces many of Haddad's strengths rather than complementing them. Both are very well-spoken, solid progressives who appeal sort of most obviously to upper middle class, well-educated people in the urban centers, which isn't to say that their message doesn't resonate with poorer voters. It absolutely does. Clearly, the polls show that. But this is an area securing the vote of the PT traditional base, the workers and the poorest in Brazil, that no PT candidate can afford to cede ground on. In other words, they need to shore up this part of the electorate. They need to engage and activate the masses that Lula, better than anybody else, was able to secure in the past. The sophisticated reasoning and political argumentation of Haddad and Manuela, which I find extremely compelling, contrasts very sharply with the bumbling belligerence of Bolsonaro. Polls show that the core of his support, as Leila was saying, is composed of primarily young, educated white men who are, no doubt, I know this anecdotally, attracted to his assertive, which is to say, authoritarian personality. The poorest Brazilians can still be expected to vote for the PT in large numbers, but what I find frightening is that the extent to which Bolsonaro has been able to consolidate ample support among the middle and upper classes, groups that equate the return of the PT to corruption, economic crisis, and violence in the streets. Bolsonaro's simplistic talk of unleashing police forces against any and all criminal elements is intuitively appealing to many Brazilians who are legitimately afraid of rampant criminality. There is also a small but significant group of voters, as Leila said, who like Bolsonaro's unapologetic defense of the military dictatorship that governed Brazil from 1964 to 1985. This, to me personally, has been one of the most perplexing things about the Bolsonaro phenomenon. Openly praising the dictatorship has been taboo for basically since the return of democracy for elected officials. Here and there it's happened, but for any leading presidential candidate, it's been totally off the table. And the fact that he has seemingly paid no political price for this, quite the opposite, I think should really worry anybody with any kind of democratic inclinations. So what stands in Bolsonaro's way? For one, women, right? A Facebook group created by women against Bolsonaro briefly exploded onto the scene in mid-September, quickly garnering some 2 million female adherents before it was hacked by Bolsominions, which is what Bolsonaro's followers are derisively called. The hashtag Ele Não, which started out as a clear, sort of female-driven rejection of Bolsonaro, became a trending topic on Twitter and inspired hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets in Brazil and around the world, including here at Brown, to take to the streets and protest his potential election. At the ballot box, poor women in particular may be the nation's firewall against a Bolsonaro presidency, hopefully. Although in a worrisome development, recent polls suggest Bolsonaro has actually been able to increase his support among women voters generally. But I think the most logical explanation for that is that conservative women who were voting for other people, like João Amoedo and some others, are migrating to Bolsonaro. In other words, he's not increasing his reach among all women, just mobilizing conservative women, I hope. Bolsonaro's extremism, which fuels anti-PT sentiment just as much as it draws sustenance from it, appears to be contagious. Haddad's rise in the polls have pushed more and more voters to want Lula to stay behind bars, for example, to reject Haddad in increasing numbers, and to mobilize support behind Bolsonaro already in the first round of voting. So the success of Haddad has scared many voters into Bolsonaro's arms. People who might otherwise reject him are seeing him as a lesser evil. In São Paulo, for example, the richest state in the nation, one of the leading candidates for governor has already taken a harsher line in his public proclamations, no doubt sensing opportunity in the bloodlust championed by Bolsonaro. So the headline that came out today is João Dória said, when he takes office in January, the police will shoot to kill. This is why Haddad, who is a soft-spoken professor of philosophy, anyone who's ever seen him speak in videos or anything like that, knows that, sort of intuitively by looking at him, that he's not a Bolsonaro of the left. This is why he needs to extend his support beyond those who are already favorably inclined to the PT. In a climate defined by partisan hostility against the Workers' Party, it's not enough to rely on those who look back fondly on the Lula years. That the legacy of Lula is, I argue, will not be enough to secure victory this time, like it did for Dilma in the past. Haddad needs to win back erstwhile Democrats who are seemingly ready for a far-right adventure. The fate of Brazilian democracy may depend on his ability to do just that, and I'm curious to hear what you all think and to convince me that I'm wrong, that the stakes are not nearly so high and that the race is much closer than it seems, but right now I'm not optimistic. So thank you, and that's all I have to say.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers of this event, especially Jimmy and Ramon, for the invitation, and also to greet my roundtable colleagues, Leila and André. As I'm the last one, I'm sorry, but I have to repeat a lot of ideas that my colleagues expressed, but it's difficult to be very creative in this moment. My presentation is divided in two moments. In the first one, I outline a brief overview of the upcoming Brazilian election and point out its degree of unpredictability. In the second moment, I, using some unpublished documents, especially letters that were sent to Lula in jail, I comment on the rooting degree of the so-called Lulismo in the Brazilian population, resorting less to an ideological perspective or quantitative methodology and more to a political culture of feelings or a culture of affections. We were given the hard, and I may say almost impossible mission of make sense of Brazil's 2018 presidential election. This is another difficult word, undoubtedly the most important election in Brazil history after the country's redemocratizations, due to the eras of the past invoked, the forces it puts at stake in the present, and the projects for the future that it signals. For a long time, we have not had such a great radicalization of political life, as my colleagues said. And I want to make clear, as André said, not due to the fact that the candidates most likely to reach the second round represent extremes of the ideological spectrum, as the Brazilian press want to make people believe, but because one of these candidates, Jair Bolsonaro, from the Social Liberal Party, Partido Social Liberal, embodies a course of action politically marked by violence, also on a physical basis, against opponents and advocate a project with a clear fascist inclination. The other top-ranked candidate, Fernando Haddad, from the Workers' Party, Partido dos Trabalhadores, does not represent the extreme left wing. On the contrary, his party, while holding power for more than 12 years, established a center-left wing government, moderate in the economic sphere, taking a series of measures to include the poorest population sectors, such as the program Bolsa Família, the program My House, My Life, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, quotas for black-skinned, brown-skinned, and poor people in public universities, but also avoiding drastic measures of income distribution, such as a tax reform that could forcefully tax the rich population sectors. Therefore, this is the first idea I want to share with you, and I want to leave to our debate. The election is polarized, but there is no equivalence between anti-Bolsonarism and anti-Petism. Just to give a personal example, as Leila, of this difficult atmosphere. I came back 2 days ago from Brazil, and unlike other elections, I did not have the courage to put on my clothes an adhesive of the candidate I support, Fernando Haddad, since colleagues and friends warned me about the risk I ran of being assaulted. And there is a reason for that, because a colleague who put a Haddad sticker on his car had the vehicle, the car's glass broken. Another major question. This is an election with a large margin of unpredictability and subject to many upheavals. Okay, all elections, or most of them, are like this, and that's what provides them with a flavor. But this election, it's very hard. But in this election, it's very hard to predict anything, especially due to the total instability of the social and political game caused by the impeachment against the elected President Dilma Rousseff. I list herein some elements that contribute to this unpredictability. A lot of things. The aforementioned polarization and fascistization of the election generated by the extreme right-wing candidate Jair Bolsonaro. Due to Bolsonaro phenomenon, the end of the polarization, as Jimmy said, PT versus PSDB, that had marked the elections at the federal level since the redemocratization. Both of these parties, are parties born out of the struggle against the dictatorship. And despite their strong differences, they observed until the last elections the democratic rules established by the 1988 Federal Constitution. The fairly balanced competition between two center-left-wing forces, symbolized by the candidacies of Haddad and Ciro Gomes, a fact that had not been seen since 1989, when Lula and Leonel Brizola fought inch by inch for a seat in the second round. The adherence of various society sectors to conservative and reactionary discourses with a mature, racist, homophobic, and pro-dictatorship nature, which supports Bolsonaro candidacy, eclipsing right-wing and center-right-wing candidates who advocate an economic program similar to Bolsonaro, but relying on liberal moral and behavioral agendas. The arrest of the most important popular leader in the country by means of a lawsuit at least quite suspicious, who, if he was a candidate, might have a great chance of being elected president even in the first round. The almost total alignment of the judicial power, including the Supreme Court, to anti-petism. The first action of the mainstream media against Lula and the PT candidacies, which is not really a novelty. It's a long tradition of the media. The declarations from armed sectors in favor of Bolsonaro's candidacy, even with threats of breaking the democratic order in a way that has not been seen, at least so explicitly, since the end of the dictatorship. A movement, as André said, with a supra-party nature named Ele Não, not him, carried out by women of various social classes and ethnicities. Women are, according to electoral surveys, the main force of opposition to Bolsonaro, which has gained great momentum in recent days, also including TV and music celebrities, and this seems to have a major impact on the middle classes, I hope. Unforeseeable events but explainable due to the violence atmosphere that has marked the electoral campaign, such as the attack against Bolsonaro. Given all these factors, it's very difficult to make more accurate forecasts, although everything indicates that Bolsonaro goes to the second round with one of the center-left-wing candidates, Fernando Haddad or Ciro Gomes, probably the first. Both of them, as the current electoral surveys show, have a good chance of beating Bolsonaro in the second round. I am a little more optimistic. But we do not know which variables can intervene from then on. Moreover, regardless of who is elected president, we must be attentive to the great difficulties that will be imposed on the new ruler, particularly due to three factors. The aforementioned political and social polarization, the partisanization of the justice system, and the possibility of electing a national congress even more conservative than the current one, where the three Bs stand out. The Ox's row of seats, bancada do boi, consisting of agribusiness representatives, the Boulos row of seats, bancada da bala, consisting of those who advocate population armament, and the Bible's row of seats, bancada da Bíblia, consisting of conservative religious group. All the three Bs are supporting forces of the Bolsonaro candidacy. Once this broader panel is outlined, I want to cite two letters that were sent to Lula shortly after his arrest in Curitiba. The first letter by Miliandre Garcia, who spoke a little bit of the letters and a poster motivating people to write to the president some of the letters, and the letter of Miliandre Garcia, who spoke of his social origins in this way. When I was a girl, I got tired of peeling potatoes and storing the peels to fry them too. Meat, fruits, and vegetables, everything was very restricted at the poor people's table. At that time, my mother divorced from my father, who drank a lot, and began to work as a maid in order to, alone, feed, dress, and educate her two children. When the university entrance exam came, vestibular, I really wished to enter the course of law, but all the four of a public school student was not enough to fight for the same vacancy with private school students. She eventually entered the less sought-after history course. It's a colleague of us. Then she pursued a master's, a PhD, and a postdoc degree. I quote, "I studied at the best public universities in the country. I had a scholarship. I lived in France. All of this thanks to the changes, structural, mentality-driven, that your administration and Dilma's promoted. Today, as a professor at a university in the state of Paraná, she claims, I keep witnessing the impact of changes implemented in your administration and Dilma's, inside and outside the university. No matter how much conflict there is, and that's good because it's a proof that we are no longer pushing our most visible social problems, such as social inequality and racism, under the rug, and the society today is faced with the need to discuss them and overcome them. And in this context, the university, fortunately, has been the stage of these changes. She further emphasizes, I would like to know that there are a multitude of people at your side and that we are fighting, each in her or his own way, for your liberation. We will not rest until you come back to your path of struggle, for which you have always been predestined. In her turn, Another letter from Patricia Frois had a very different life story. Patricia. I grew up in a rich family in the south zone of Rio de Janeiro. I attended private schools and I studied film at the PUC Rio, Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and at the University of Paris. And she acknowledged, I would not have at first the classic profile of the people directly benefited by the public policies implemented during the PT administration. Then she underlines, for the first time in my life, it was not me, the privileged one, who received privileges. It was not me, the well-born, white-skinned girl, who gained voice, benefits, and protagonism. And she further highlights, even so, my life has gotten better. Life gets better when your nanny's daughter graduates from law school. Life gets a lot better when I visit my elitist college and I see that it's much more colorful. That the airport has become a democratic place. Life gets much better when women and black-skinned people begin to trust themselves. And she finishes like this. I thank you only for having made ever better a life that had already been good, indeed. The letters of Miliandre and Patricia are among the hundreds that I could read thanks to the kindness of the Lula Institute in São Paulo. These women with very different backgrounds and life stories interrupted for a few moments their daily course to thank Lula for the improvements brought by his administration to the country. Unlike the letters sent to Getúlio Vargas, already analyzed by other authors, they do not put themselves in a position inferior to the president, as someone who asks for favors. On the contrary, both recognize advances and sympathize with Lula for the injustice they believe that he's going through. With different styles, they seem to be representative documents of a broader cultural universe, where more than clear political ideology, feelings, affections, perceptions of concrete improvements, and feelings of solidarity and injustice intersect. Such letters seems to me useful in order to think of the phenomenon of Lulism, which undoubtedly guides the coming elections. After all, they let us know what goes on in the mind and in the heart of people who will surely make the difference by casting their votes at the polling stations. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is part of a tradition here. We're going to take, and it's a tradition in Brazil, we're going to take 3 or 4 people who want to make comments, ask them not to make long speeches, and ask questions. And then we'll let the panelists answer them very briefly, and then we'll take a second round. We have the room until 9 o'clock. I know some of you have to go back and finish papers and study, but feel free to stay until then, and then we'll be able to linger afterward to talk. So we'll take our first round of questions. Anyone wants to make a question or a comment? Feel free to do that. Anyone shy to kick it off? Okay, Alex and then Luis, and then let's add a third person here just so we have another person. Why don't you start, Alex?
Hey, meu nome é Ale, I'm from São Paulo. My question is, we can see that the market has shown a lot of support for Bolsonaro. For instance, the stock, Bovespa, from a couple days ago, had its highest level in 2 years after the latest polls were released. My question is, Bolsonaro, like historically, he has not been like a conservative in economic terms would be. So he has voted against like the Plano Real, against like cutting salaries and wages for public workers. So my question is, why do you think the market is endorsing Bolsonaro so much in opposition to more like pro-market, historically based candidates such as Alckmin or even Amoedo? And is that due to like the huge unpopularity of Alckmin, who's like traditionally known figure?
Good, we have Luis, and we're gonna get a microphone so that people who are watching this stream can hear it, so that's why we're gonna ask to use the microphone.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Luis Valente, professor of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies and Comparative Literature here at Brown. I was very intrigued by something that André said. Let me read my notes here. Haddad and Bolsonaro are not symmetrical opposites, because I've been thinking about the same thing. I've been thinking, oh, you're sitting there, now you're sitting here. I don't have my glasses. I've been thinking a little bit about the continuities between the two. And so I totally agree with you on that. I think that part of the issue here is that this election has been dominated by a sense of nostalgia for a golden age, both on the side of Bolsonaro and the side of those who support Haddad. We know very well that that the golden age did not exist. The military regime was a dictatorship. Yes, there was economic progress, but there was rampant corruption, torture, censorship, and irresponsible economic decisions that resulted in the 1982 debt crisis, and then eventually on all the problems in the 90s, in the 80s, and part of the 90s. I think there's something similar among people who support Haddad. Thinking of the Lula administration as a golden age. In fact, there was a lot of social progress, and the economic situation was, at least in the first half of Lula's government, very strong. But despite the advances, there was, again, very parallel, rampant corruption. There were irresponsible economic decisions in the Lula government, particularly after the crisis in 2008. Brazil did not adjust to what was a tsunami, economic tsunami. Lula called it marolinha, he called it a wavelet. And we are now, actually people refuse to admit the fact that we're now really dealing with the consequences of a lot of bad decisions that were made by the Lula regime. And just to finish here, I'm very, very concerned about signs of authoritarianism coming from both camps. And I'm talking about this because I think Haddad is going to be in the second round with Bolsonaro. And I tend to agree with you. I think that Bolsonaro is going to be the next president of Brazil. Unfortunately, I don't think Haddad can beat Bolsonaro. But again, we know what Bolsonaro stands for in terms of authoritarian thinking. But look what is coming from the PT, stuff that is really scary. Project to control the media, known as democratização da imprensa, Franklin Martins and others. I'm very concerned about that. Recent statements by José Dirceu, for example. I'm very close to finishing, Jim. A couple of statements by José Dirceu. It's more important than winning the election is to take over power. That he said that to El País. And more recently, it's important to take away the power of investigation from the judiciary. So I'm probably as pessimistic as you are, André, but hopefully we're going to prove wrong. Who knows, maybe even this Sunday. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a third person who wants to ask a question. Anyone wants to speak? Just make sure we have 2 men who've spoken. Women can speak here also. Anyone? So go for it. Is it Jack that raised his hand? Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. So I'm really curious that you guys had said previously before Lula's imprisonment that he had showed to be one of the leading potential candidates. And you know, we had a similar phenomenon in the United States where there were a lot of former Bernie Sanders supporters who then became supporters of the Trump campaign. And I'm curious if you could speak to people who were former supporters of Lula and the PT under Lula, yet have now shown more support for Bolsonaro, and kind of just explaining that.
So I think what we want to do is, one more question, anyone right now? One more. So we'll do the panel going through that and answering, and then we'll do a second round. We have lots of time. So, and people don't have to respond, or they can respond to what they have to respond to. It's up to you to do that. Do you want to start, Leila?
I'm going to respond, or try to respond, because I don't think I have an answer. It's more of, again, an anecdote. So when I was in Rio this summer, we took a lot of taxis and Ubers, and actually, I think we took one with you at some point, and we made a point to always ask people, okay, who are you going to vote for, et cetera. And a lot of people said, if Lula was running, and this was before, it was really decided that he was not going to run, there was still some doubt there. If Lula was running, I would vote for him, and people, there was this kind of the idea of Lula did all these good things, although there was also some criticism voiced, but in general it was, a positive view of the PT. But if he doesn't run, then I'm going to go for Bolsonaro. And then the question was, well, but why, right? And the things that came up were primarily, okay, corruption. Everybody's corrupt. He's not corrupt. So there's this rejection, much like in this country, of the political establishment that is seen as this bog, basically. And the other really important factor was violence. These are people who are from low-income communities that are very much affected by violence, drug trafficking, et cetera. And they saw, and I forgot to actually show the slide where Bolsonaro outlines his policies for public security, right? And he wants to allow, for example, policemen to not be, go to trial for killing people, right? A judge for killing people, among other, and lower the age for being judged as an adult, et cetera, to 16. And so people thought that would really help, that and then being able to carry guns, to carry weapons, So they were very much in tune with that. I don't know if these people are going to go to Haddad, there's also, kind of tapping a little bit into Benito's talk. I think that there is an affective dimension, an emotional dimension that people have with Lula. They can identify with him. He has this charisma that Haddad doesn't have. He doesn't tap into, he doesn't have the life story that Lula has, that I think that a lot of people did identify with, So it was an aspirational story that Haddad doesn't have. He's, a middle-class guy, philosophy professor, et cetera. So I don't think I answered your question, but, so.
I was going to address Leila's question and Luis's comment. So I think the single most important thing Bolsonaro did to garner institutional credibility was to name Paulo Guedes as his finance minister very early on. So this is a Chicago University of Chicago trained economist, as a clear sign because of his history, as you say, as Bolsonaro's history as a statist, a nationalist. He needed to signal precisely to the market that no, his would be an administration that would be market friendly, as it were. And I think to the extent that he's been growing in the polls and remain ahead, he has the viability that the market craves, right? This sort of viability and is stable. I mean, Bolsonaro has only grown since he declared his candidacy. So I think it's the viability combined with the naming of Paulo Guedes that has really inspired the market to really get behind him. And part of what I was arguing, I think precisely this this blessing from the market has fueled this push of moderate conservatives into Bolsonaro's hands. I know in my family, I have people who have said, well, but the market. And I said, well, there are things that are more important than the market. There are things more important than what the market wants. What the market wants is not always the best, right, for the majority of people. So that's sort of one thing I would say. And Luis, I really liked what you said. An election is sort of defined by nostalgia. I think that's largely true. Now, the reason I'm not sure I accept the premise that the PT would take this opportunity to do all kinds of these things you mentioned is because, and maybe again, I'm wrong and counterfactual, but they didn't do it when Lula was at 80% approval. they didn't do it when they could have. Lula could have run for a third term. He could have changed the constitution and almost certainly been able to do it. But he didn't. He said no, right? He restrained, unlike other places in Latin America, where that opportunity was seized by powerful leaders. Venezuela, exactly, in Bolivia.
And Dilma did not interfere with the judiciary at all.
Right, and so, you know, one could argue they're in a position of weakness now, so they might lash out. But I think it's much more compelling to say, well, they didn't do it when they had strength. They're much more. If they're smart in any way, and Haddad is smart, he's not going to poke that bear, right? Given the position of relative weakness that he's almost certainly to come out of the election in. So, you know, that's my only sort of his salvo to what you're saying. But I love the point about the nostalgia.
Just for the first question, I think that we have 2 points. The first one, Bolsonaro is very plastic, we can say, very
Malleable.
elastic. And then he can, for example, he can give very nationalist discourses, and at the same time to do like this for the North American flag. On the one hand. On the other hand, the market is not very moral. We know that the market supports dictators in several countries. Then I think that's even the market support candidates more predictables, like Geraldo Alckmin or João Amoedo, in danger, this market, sometimes I listen, the market wake up nervous. What's this? The market, in this context of danger, prefer to support somebody on the right wing. And Professor Luis, I think that into the Workers' Party, we always had authoritarian tendencies. You know, PT is very mixed. José Dirceu, this declaration was a disaster. Then Haddad in the other day said, yeah, no, but we have these tendencies. And we have always a dispute into the party among different tendencies from the church, from the social movements, with different grades of authoritarian thoughts. But I think, and I am sure that you agree with me, that we can put in the same balance Bolsonaro and Haddad in the same level of authoritarian, but authoritarianism. Yes, but I agree with you with this element of nostalgia, and it's different because the nostalgia of the dictatorship is more, it's older. Then it's easier to create new things for this time. But the nostalgia of Lula's time, there is still an heritage, a very concrete feeling of, I said, for the common people, that the life was better. These big issues about economics and politics are more distant from the everyday life of people.
So I want to comment also, and I just want to say 2 things or 3 things very briefly. As an openly gay man, a founder of the gay rights movement in Brazil, as a feminist since 1969, and as a person in the early 60s was very committed to civil rights. This election is the most important election in Brazilian history because all of the gains of the last 30 years, if not the last 60 years, are being threatened by one of the candidates. And we need to be very clear about that. The gay and lesbian movement has struggled to expand and to build strength, and it has one ally and it has one enemy. The women's movement and feminists in Brazil have fought for the right to have protection against domestic violence and to give women many, many rights, and it has one supporter and it has one enemy. The black movement, the people who fight for racial equality in Brazil, have seen concrete, real changes in policies to expand universities for people of African descent, and has a clear supporter, the Minister of Education, while that was happening, and has an enemy which is clearly against affirmative action and all the other things I've mentioned. And so to say that this is a very crucial moment, and it will be a severe pushback for all the gains, the real gains, that have taken place in Brazil, in my mind, over the last 30 to 40 years in the fight for democratization during the dictatorship and after that. And so a nostalgia for a military regime which I lived under, which censored people, which tortured people and arrested people, and a nostalgia for a moment in which people had access to things they had never had in the 500 years of Brazilian history, is the reason why so many poor people still love Lula and still will vote for the Workers' Party as other social sectors. So that's the one comment I wanted to make, and I think the country really is at a crossroads, and I think for those of us who really care about Brazil, who teach Brazil, who love Brazil, or from Brazil, or go to Brazil a lot, there are really going to be serious times ahead.
Some of us are going to vote on Sunday.
Sorry?
Some of us are going to vote.
Right, and so in this very crucial time that is ahead, if Bolsonaro wins the elections in the end of the month, I think every single advance that has taken place in Brazil is under threat. And then, of course, will meet resistance. It will meet resistance from very strong social movements that have a tradition in Brazil of fighting back. If Haddad wins, there will be strong forces in the country which will do exactly what they did to Dilma Rousseff and to Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, to destroy their election possibilities, to just challenge the election results, as Bolsonaro has already said, and try to pull down that government. And that will be a continued polarization in the country. So those of us who do love Brazil need to pay attention to this, and those of us who are activists as well need to do something to defend democracy in Brazil, which I think is seriously under threat by one side in this election. So we have another time for another round. We have Felipe, we have Gabriela, and we have Renato. We have a lot of people now at stake, 5, 4, and 5. And we can have 5, or we can divide. We have time. So let's hear, starting with Felipe. I think so. Just speak into it.
Okay. Hello, I'm Felipe. I'm from Rio. And I'd like to ask you, like, we all talk about the threats that Bolsonaro represents to democracy, and I think most people here are aware of that. But I'd like to know, first, if you think there's a figure that's as extreme in the left, and second, what does the attempt on his life when he was stabbed, what does that mean for the threat to democracy from the other side? Is that, like, real? And, yeah, thank you.
Good. Gabriela.
Hi. Luis has already talked about this being an election that has to do with nostalgia. I also think it's an election that has to do with fear or hatred. I mean, they're both connected on both sides, like we talked about it, and even though they are different kinds of fears. So I've talked to reasonable people this past couple of weeks who are voting for Bolsonaro because they're very afraid of Brazil being turned into another Venezuela. I don't think this is going to happen. We already talked about it. Now, what's interesting is that to me it's very obvious that Brazil isn't going to become another Venezuela. And to me it's very obvious that rights are going to be jeopardized if Bolsonaro becomes president of Brazil. But for these people, it isn't. So the most common argument I hear when I say, when I ask people how they can bring themselves to vote for Bolsonaro, they say, on top of saying that they don't want PT in power, they say, do you really think that Bolsonaro is going to be able to pass these things that he's saying he will? So, like, why do they not think that he's going to be able to do the things that he's going to say? And even if he weren't able to do it by himself, a third of the Brazilian population is clearly in favor of this. And the Congress is going to become, as we saw, is going to become even more conservative than it already is. And even if it wasn't as conservative as it seems like it's going to become, and as it already is, it would seek support from the parts of the population that intended on voting for him and that are going to at least take him to the second round. So I'm just trying to understand, where does this argument come from that he's not going to be able to do the things that he says he's going to do?
I don't remember who raised their hand, but there was an order of 3, 4, and 5.
It's very much.
It was not here, and then there were two over on the side.
It's not here, and then 4 and 5.
Hi. So we're having an election soon, and there's definitely a tie, according to all the polls, between Haddad and Bolsonaro. I mean, each one can guess who is going to win, but it's definitely a tie. Nobody can know. But my question is, like, it seems that among the elites there is the idea that PT can't rule the country. Like, it's not acceptable. Doesn't matter what comes from the election. We saw it happening 2 years ago. So I don't know if you think that something's going to be, they're going to do something to get PT out of the power if they win the election, and if it's like what we're living now is kind of a flip side, if you're going to be run by Bolsonaro, extreme right, or by someone from Centrão again, because probably they're going to take PT out of the power if PT wins the election. So, I mean, there is a threat to democracy that it isn't limited to Bolsonaro, as we have seen after last election. So after the election, I mean, what can we do from now to protect democracy, even if Bolsonaro doesn't win, because he's not the only threat?
Back there. We want to be able to film it because he'll be here in a second. And it's good that you stand.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Rio. I just wanted to ask in a more broad way. What do you think about new party candidate João Moedo?
Okay. And Alex, where's Alex?
Not quite. My name is Rakan. It's okay. It's okay though. And I'm a senior here, and I studied abroad in Rio about a year ago. So one of the things, Leila, I think it was you that mentioned, in terms of motivations for Bolsonaro supporters, was insecurity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, that being such a big concern, both generally in Brazil and especially in this election, what kinds of things are being done on the PT side to accommodate for people worried about that, especially people in the periphery, where that's honestly the biggest problem, or not the biggest problem, but it's the biggest problem there compared to like safer urban centers. And it's obviously something that, even though that's a traditional base of support, I think a lot of people care about. So I was just hoping to get your opinions and thoughts on that. Thank you.
Good. Okay, let's do the second answer, and again, you can respond to any or all of the questions. Leila.
Okay.
Just speak
I'm going
into
to
the
start kind of, oh, sorry. I'm going to try to answer your question. So I don't think that there's anybody on the left that is as extreme as Bolsonaro. He is, and he continuously comes off with very extreme viewpoints that I'm not seeing coming from the left, right? I'm not really sure I understood your second question about his about the attack on his life. So do you mind just kind of explaining that a little bit more?
What I mean is, like, what does that mean for the future of democracy in Brazil?
Okay.
Is that an example of a threat to democracy from the left? Because we know that the assaultant was like affiliated to the PSOL, right?
A former affiliated.
Family said he was crazy, so.
Yeah, I think that his mental health was more of an issue than his party affiliation. I mean, he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't pronounce that it was because of a party. It was God made me do it. So I think, that being said, I think that the vitriol in this campaign the lack of civility in the discourses, that's not just during the campaign, but that preceded it also. Not just, one candidate against the other, but also, for example, Bolsonaro's attacks against, parts of the population, large parts of the population, Afro-Brazilians, indigenous peoples, women, the LGBTQ community, et cetera. That is a threat to democracy. There's not this fear of civil interaction, of political dialogue seems to be shrinking. And what is taking place is, this polarization where dialogue is no longer possible. And in a democracy, you need that. You need a public sphere where people can engage with one another and agree to disagree, which is not happening. So I don't think that the attack per se represents a threat, because that, I think, was an outlier. But, kind of the violence that it maybe metaphorizes is a threat, yes. But I think that there are other elements that, for example, Renato, called our attention to that are much more pressing in that sense.
Yes, so still on this question of is there something similar to Bolsonaro on the left? I mean, one of the things that I think is important to remember, too, is institutional power and institutional support, right? Bolsonaro, his vice president is a general. Just by comparison, his vice presidential nominee is a general. Haddad's is a former congresswoman, someone who has a history of elected office. So even if one of these sides wanted to carry out some kind of horrible, coup, Haddad does not have the army, right? I mean, if we think sort of material terms, Bolsonaro does. So it's one thing to talk about sort of the desire of people on the left to do something similar to what Bolsonaro has talked about doing. It's one thing to have the institutional means to be able to do that. And about the stabbing, I'm not advocating by any stretch of the imagination a conspiracy theory, but clearly it didn't hurt Bolsonaro. I mean, physically it did, but it didn't hurt his campaign, right? If anything, it helped his campaign, exactly, because he's been able to play the victim from the hospital bed, to deny that he ever made inflammatory comments that might have... Right,
not
to put it
participate
back.
in the debates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I've argued this before, but it's not inconceivable that him shutting up and leaving the scene for a little bit can only help him, right? Because people like Ciro are dying to have him at the debate, so they can just tear him apart. But he's able to say, "Well, I'm recovering." So, not to say that it was planned in any way at all, but it's only, I think, helped his chances. And I agree with Leila. It's largely an outlier. I know plenty of people who say, "Well, it wouldn't be the worst thing if he didn't recover," but nobody's actually planning, anything against his life. About João Amoedo, this is the person who I see probably the most on my Facebook feed from my family and all these people. The most of whom I think are disaffected Tucanos who have noticed that Alckmin isn't going anywhere. And to be very fair to Amoedo, I think there is an energy that he's been able to mobilize with the Partido Novo. It's not, I don't think, a particularly new idea, right? There's nothing new about calling yourself new, right? So, but I do put them on the sort of the side of civilization, which I'm not sure Bolsonaro is. I see them as a center-right party that has a very liberal economic agenda. That's the enemy that we should be, or we, the PT, should be facing. Right, not this sort of existential threat posed by Bolsonaro, I think. So, if there's any other questions, and the question of whether he can do the things he says he wants to do. Now, to me, that's very much a central question, but it's in another way, it's sort of besides the point, right? Because when Trump was running here, there was this debate. Well, he's not actually going to do that, right? It's just, but he's done a fraction of that. And it's hurt a lot of people, right? Not least children who have been in prison at the border, separated from their parents. So if Bolsonaro is 10% of the threat that we think he is, it will really hurt a lot of people.
Yeah, and the Bancada do Boi, Bíblia e Bala is, I think, a third of Congress at the moment. So, and they stand to gain more. So, he probably can do a lot of these things,
But I think you're right. I think in the second round, we're going to hear a lot of that
Yeah.
from people around him and voters. Well, he doesn't actually mean it. It's sort of he's exaggerating for effect.
It's taken
but
out of context. That's
taken out of
the other-
context,
yeah,
exactly.
That's the big kind of excuse.
I'm here just to confirm your analysis. I'm here in U.S. Since January, February, in fact, and sometimes it's possible to compare Bolsonaro and Trump. For example, sometimes I watch on TV. They show, for example, a video of Trump saying something terrible, and he said, "No, I didn't say this." And it's possible to yes. Then I think that's the same thing with Bolsonaro. He can, in this context, change each day. He can change his opinion about several things, or people can think that no, he's saying this, but he didn't. He doesn't think like this.
Yeah, I mean, to reiterate that point, so the 80 no marches were on the 29th, right? The next day they had I don't know if they were called 80 Sim marches, but they were, in support of Bolsonaro. And there were altercations in the Paulista between Bolsonaro supporters and people who were there, but also against the media. And they were very, very violent against the media. And they were basically accusing the media, which is a little bit ironic, of, deturpar a imagem of Bolsonaro and creating fake news. So they're definitely taking a page from the handbook of North American politics and adapting it to Brazil. So anything that Bolsonaro says it's outrageous, they're like, no, this is fake news. It was taken out of context. He never said that.
The system. I am against the
yeah.
system. Yeah. But I think that, trying to be a little bit optimistic, I think that this context is very important to us to understand better other contexts of Brazilian history, for example, the dictatorship. We can understand better how people can support an authoritarian guy. We can understand better that we can continue living, especially the middle class, even with an authoritarian government or an authoritarian treat. And this is terrible, but it's good to us to understand better the political culture of Brazilian society. Because, of course, Bolsonaro didn't create this situation. He opened something through this conservative thought, homophobia, racism. Oh, grow up.
Yeah. And this kind of goes back to what Luis was saying, the nostalgia, right? I think that the nostalgia for the PT is something more recent for obvious reasons, but the nostalgia for the dictatorship is not something that is particular to this election. I think it was there, latent for a long time, and I say this from experiences in, círculos conhecidos, etc., but also from, when I read the news, sometimes I'll scroll down to the comments, and a lot of the comments, for a long period of time have expressed this nostalgia towards the dictatorship, it was better, it was more secure, it was...
There was torture, but it's very isolated. They did something... Dita Branda, yeah.
I just wanted to make another comment that hasn't been, I think, mentioned here, which is really important. If we think of the United States and the media and the newspapers and the televisions, we really have a diversity of opinions. We have Fox News that has a very clear position, but in the last 2 years, the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, and some of the major broadcasts have offered different points of view, different readings of things, and that really is not the case in Brazil. And I read the Folha de São Paulo, Estadão, and Globo every day, and I really do read them every day. And it's as if we had just Fox News here in this country to know what's happening. And of course, those newspapers rely on assinaturas, the subscriptions, and so they have liberal columnists in those papers that provide liberal ideas, but hundreds of times, and I've even suffered it myself in having done something and then have it manipulated by a headline in Folha, that this is a constant way of manipulating the news in order to make a very specific outcome for that. And so I think we have to keep in mind also that many, many people have developed a series of ideas about what's happening in Brazil based on constant reception of news through Jornal Nacional, the national news, the global news, and the major media. And that, I think, colors a lot of people's opinions on things, because very clearly one side is constantly presented and other sides are presented on blogs, on your Facebook, on some electronic sites, and maybe Carta Capital. And that's a real difference between here and there. And finally, the proposals, the most recent proposals of the Workers' Party about the media are not to control the media, but to say, let's do what they do in the United States. Let's say that you can't have a major newspaper and a major TV station in the same media community. Let's say that we want to think about having diversification of the media in the country, as opposed to saying that we're no longer allowing a given newspaper or a given media outlet, a given television station to have its license removed. Okay, so we have time for another round, and then we'll end at 9 o'clock. If there are more questions, feel free to leave if you need to. 1, 2, 3, 4. Great.
I guess like a lot of you have like alluded to Brazil like mirroring the U.S. In terms of like the vitriol and like I guess like inability to have dialogue between the two sides. Do you think that Brazil is like a domino from the U.S. election, and do you think the 2016 election in the U.S. colors the way you view Brazil's election now in any way? And do you think it's like in Haddad's best interest to have like Manuela form like a communist as his vice president if he wants to reach out and develop like a stronger coalition of voters, especially when there's a lot of fear that Brazil could turn into Venezuela and become communist?
Number 2, I don't do a job of remembering who. I think we're back there. Right?
Your name, please?
Daniel.
Daniel, thank you.
Hi, my name is Mauricio. I'm back here. I'm a senior. I wanted to ask more about André's comments about how Haddad can't expect like the momentum from Lula won't really carry him through, and assuming that he goes through to the segundo turno, how do you expect, or how do you think in the next 3 weeks or the following 3 weeks he can build on that momentum and mobilize more of the rest of the center-left who voted for Alckmin and Ciro Gomes, or the part of the traditional PT's base who's going towards Bolsonaro, and how he...
Is it? I don't think so. It's like symbolic. Yeah.
Symbolic.
I think I'm wondering, it's easy thinking about Trump's election in the U.S., thinking about Brexit, and thinking about other recent like populist right-wing candidates coming to power, to think of this sort of rhetoric play and the sort of proposals that he's coming with as a relatively modern populist phenomena, right? And seeing connections between the Philippines and the U.S. and the U.K. and Brazil. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you see this as being connected and as somewhat a recent form of a populist upsurge, or actually how much of this can we find in the history, at least in the case of Brazil, right, of other right-wing candidates using this same kind of rhetoric. I guess in terms of the relationship to media, we could think it's a bit more modern, but I'm wondering how much of it is, it's fake to think of it as something new.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Lauren. I was wondering if the panel could speak just a little bit about what this election means for some of the environmental issues and controversies in Brazil as well. touched on that yet.
So, any order people on the panel can speak? Anyone who wants to start?
Well, I guess.
Well, I started last week.
Okay, so I guess these two questions I think can be addressed together. I think there's no doubt, right, that Bolsonaro, the momentum comes a lot from the global moment of right-wing ascendancy around the world. Certainly, after Trump won, Bolsonaro got on Twitter right away, congratulated him, and said in 2018 it'll be our turn to shock the establishment in the same way. So he's clearly sort of attuned to what's going on. At the same time, though, I think it's important to see Bolsonaro as a Brazilian phenomenon, as someone who, for example, draws on the tradition of a conservative right-wing nationalism within the armed forces, for example. As Benito, I think, said, he's very much a nationalist, at least in his discourse, in his rhetoric. And also, so that sort of nationalism combined with an authoritarian impatience for democracy, I think, right? Which has a long history in Brazil. So I suppose I would say it's both. It's absolutely driven by global events, but it's very much a Brazilian type of phenomenon. Whereas in the United States, Trump had this kind of showman personality, snake oil salesman, which is very much part of American culture. Bolsonaro has this sort of right-wing military figure that's also a kind of reoccurring figure in Brazilian history. The other question about, well, let me take the environmental question first. So I was following a conversation today on Twitter. Haddad has committed himself to proposing aggressive renewable energy standards. But I've seen a commentator was saying, well, frankly, I find that very unlikely because the pressure will be for short-term economic growth, which might involve a reliance on traditional fossil fuels to really spur that. In other words, it might not be the moment for a vulnerable, weak government to push for a full-scale economic transformation to more reliable fuel. Brazil is not that bad on a lot of those issues. Of course, not when it comes to the rainforest and all this, but I'm not sure we'll see a lot of progress on that front, unfortunately, with either side, with either government.
And sorry, we have to recognize that the Dilma's government was terrible for environment. She was a desenvolvimentista, yeah, without worries about environment. It's sad, but we have to say. I hope that they learn with this bad experience.
Well, in I was just going to confirm. Bolsonaro said he would open the Amazon for foreign exploration, so that kind of gives you an idea where he stands in environmental issues, right?
And no lands for Indians.
That's a really important question you ask also, because I think we've been approached by Woods Hole and also by people in England who are very interested in seeing Brown as a center for thinking about the Amazon. We've done that in the past, and we want to continue and expand that. And I would say that clearly programmatically, Haddad's program as written talks about all the kinds of things we would like them to talk about, whereas Bolsonaro talks about all the things we wouldn't like them to talk about. And I think one of the roles that a lot of the NGOs who are kind of desconfiado, don't trust, because of the way that the PT was unequal in what it did. It did some very good work in deforestation and did some bad work in terms of the rainforest. But I think the role will be for NGOs to pressure them, but they'll have an opening and a possibility because they're within a larger camp of the progressive forces. Whereas I'm not at all sure that Bolsonaro would listen to anyone who cares about, he certainly doesn't care about indigenous people, and he's made that explicit. He certainly is very much alive to the economic forces that would want to exploit the Amazon even more, which means much more. And the Ruralist Association has clearly come out in favor of Bolsonaro. So those who are really seeing agribusiness as the only way for economic growth of the country are clearly on one side of this battle at this point. And that's very alarming for people who really do care about environmental questions.
To this question about how Haddad will unite sort of anti-Bolsonaro forces. So one thing that I guess has given me some comfort in recent days is people who say the PT hasn't even started on Bolsonaro yet. in terms of tearing them apart. People point to the PT's successful attempt at really destroying Marina's chances in the last election in a relatively short time span through their, the advertising campaign and their ability to mobilize their voters. So I suppose that's one thing that PT will really turn their attention to in the second round, is deconstructing Bolsonaro among this base of working people and poorer people. But and on top of that, I think it's clear that Ciro Gomes' his sizable electorate will almost all transfer to Haddad. The same for Guilerme Boulos' numbers. So going into the second round, right, both sides will have some wind at their back from these other candidacies. But as I said in my talk, I'm not sure that that's going to be enough for Haddad. I mean, certainly he will grow, and he's getting better as a candidate, but it's a numbers game, right? There are only so many people that either side will end up with. And I'm not sure that this nostalgia that we've been talking about for the Lula years will earn him enough from the other side. So I just don't know. I hope so.
So, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, all of you who can come to other events in the past. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, really quick.
Okay, all right, fine. One last.
Hi, I'm Marina. I'm a grad student at the Portuguese and Brazilian Studies Department. I'm from Brazil as well. So we here, there's 4 women here in this room, we just started today a committee to defend democracy in Brazil at Brown University. Because if one thing is clear from this talk, is that no matter the outcome of this election, we are in for a really bumpy 4 years if we get it. And all of this dictatorship talk and a coup is very possible and all of that. So we are creating a sort of network amongst Brazilians in the United States. It's not a partisan word in English, partisan movement. We are very much opposed to Bolsonaro, though. So yes, Tiny has signs. So our goal is to set up a network of friendship would be the word in a way, and create some sort of camaraderie with other Brazilians here who are interested. So if you are interested in talking to us and participating and knowing what we are up to and what the next steps are, you can talk to any of the 4 of us, and we'll be more than happy to give you more information and our contact information and all of that. It's not only for women. It's open to everyone.
Everyone, regardless of where you're from, regardless of your political position, regardless of your gender.
Yeah. It's not open to only Brazilians. It's really it's a network of people who are interested in the stability of the country, right? Democratic stability of the country.